online Git repositories enable you to store a copy of your Git repository online, and it can easily be shared among multiple computers and multiple users. Let's learn about two of the online Git repository service providers, GitHub and Bitbucket, in a little bit more detail. We'll look at how we can set up our local Git repository to be mirrored in an online Git repository. There are several online Git repository service providers. Two of the most popular ones are GitHub and Bitbucket. I will go through in more detail about how you can set up your Git repository that you prepared in the previous exercise to be mirrored on an online Git repository on Bitbucket. To set up an online Git repository, go to one of these online service providers and then sign up for an account. So here I have signed up into my Bitbucket account, and I have my homepage open here. And so I'm going to create a new repository online on my Bitbucket repository. So I just click on the create repository, and then this would come up with some details. Now this varies with the repository service provider. So here I will specify the name of the repository as git test, and then I'm going to mark this as a private repository. For this course and all the remaining courses in the specialization, I would strongly advise you to keep your repositories as private repositories, because you don't want somebody else to be copying the code that you might save in your online Git repository. So please make sure that you only use private repositories in this specialization. So I will sign up as a Git private repository and then simply click on create repository, and then it'll do some setup and then be ready for me. Okay. Now what I need to do is to copy this particular URL for my repository. So you will see a URL for the repository in the home page of the repository. So just copy that URL for the repository, because we would need that in order to synchronize our local Git repository with this repository. So I'm going to copy that, and since I have already created my local Git repository, I'm going to go in there and set that up to be mirrored in this online Git repository. So for that, we need to use a couple of Git commands that enable us to do this. Going to the command prompt in my Git repository folder, I will type git remote add origin and then paste the URL for my Bitbucket repository that I've just created and hit the return. So now my local Git repository's remote origin is set to the Bitbucket repository. So now I want to be able to push the entire contents of my local Git repository to my online Git repository. So reviewing the commands for setting up the online Git repository, the first one that we just did, git remote add origin and the repository URL. And so this will add the online repository as the remote repository for my local Git repository. Once I do that, then I need to push my contents to my online repository. For that, I do git push -u origin master, and this command would push the local Git repository to the online repository. So let's type that at the command prompt. So once I type this at the command prompt and hit the return, it's going to set up my Git repository. Sometimes it may ask you to type in your credentials, including your password on your Bitbucket account. So you may have to do that. I had already done that previously, so that's why it didn't ask me again for the password. But once I type that in, then the contents of my local Git repository will be pushed to the server side. So now the data on my local Git repository is now matched on the server side. So let's go to Bitbucket to see the status of my online Git repository now. Going to my Bitbucket and then reviewing the online Git repository, you would see that there has been a branch, the master branch that has been pushed to my online Git repository. I can then examine the source by looking at the source here, and then you can see that I have the index.html file, which is exactly the same as what I have in my local Git repository, and examine the various commits also. So I can look at the state in the second commit and at the first commit. So you can now see that all this information has been uploaded to the online repository, including the history of all the commits. Then going back there, you can see more details about all the commits that have been sent to the server side. I can examine each of those commits in a bit more detail. And then going back to the source, I can look at more details of the source like that there. So that has now set up my local Git repository to be mirrored in Bitbucket. The procedure is pretty much similar even on GitHub. So let me set up an online GitHub repository. Now, obviously, you have to remember that your local repository can only be matched to one online Git repository. So I will only go through setting up the repository on GitHub, and you will notice that the same kind of commands would be required if you want to set up your local repository to be mirrored on a repository on GitHub. So on GitHub, if you log into your account, you would see something like this in your home page. You can go to the right-hand side where there's a plus sign and then click on that to create a new repository, or just click on this button here to say new repository. And then when that comes up, I can simply say git test. And then again, as a reminder, please make that a private repository. Most of these providers allow you to now store private repositories online. So why make them public unless you really want to share it with other people? So I would strongly urge you to keep your repositories private for the moment, unless if you're working with a team. I should remind you that at this moment, GitHub supports private repositories only for those subscribers who pay for their GitHub account. So it is not available for subscribers who are using their free account. So simply click on private and then create repository, and then that will create a repository. And then you would see that GitHub also gives me a bunch of commands here on how to set up the repository. So for creating a new repository on the command line, the commands that we actually had done earlier, or to push an existing repository, the same two kinds of commands that have to be issued. So that basically sets up your GitHub repository to mirror your local repository. So since I have already linked my repository to Bitbucket, I'm not going to use my GitHub repository for that purpose. So as you notice, the procedure is pretty much similar on either one of them. Give and take a few differences in the way the information is rendered on the screen in the user interface and a little bit of changes. More or less, they are similar in the way you're going to make use of them in terms of mirroring your local Git repository to the online repository here. So with this, suppose somebody gives you a Git repository. Can you make a copy of that onto your local one? So this is where we use another Git command called git clone. So now here you see that I have this git test repository. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this repository and then copy this URL. And then I'll show you how I can create a copy of that Git repository or clone this online repository into my local computer. So let's pretend that I am on a different computer, and then we'll go to our command line and then create another repository with that same name. Going to my command line, I'm just going to move up into my, and you see that I have my git test folder there. So I'm going to create another temporary folder here just to show you that I can clone an online Git repository. So in my temporary folder, you see that it is empty. So to review the command, it says git clone and the repository's URL. So let's apply this command and then clone the online Git repository, pretending that we are on another computer. So I'm going to say git clone and then paste the URL of my Bitbucket repository here, and then you would see that that repository will now get cloned into a local folder with the same name, git test. So now if I do a listing of the directory, you can see that the git test folder has been created. So let's go to the git test folder, and then you will see that this is an exact copy of the folder structure that we had created earlier. So this is how you can clone an online Git repository. So all you need to do is to obtain the URL of that Git repository and then simply use git clone to get a copy of that onto your local computer. With this, we complete this exercise on using online Git repositories. So did you finally get it?